Part 4. The Nationalists' Triumph. The Constitution. Chapter 14. Elections in the Bicameral Congress. The Nationalists who went into the convention agreed on certain broad objectives, crucial for a new government, all designed to remodel the United States into a country with the British political structure. They had the ultimate advantage of any group that knows what it wants in advance of a convention. First, there must be an overriding sovereign government with independent power to tax, regulate, and coerce states and individuals. Second, an independent and oligarchical executive administration and upper legislative house must be created and elevated to weaken the democratic and representative lower legislative house. There would, however, be vigorous discussion on the nature of representation in the bicameral Congress. It would be proportional to population or based on equality of voting. And would slaves be included? It was on these issues that voting would be bitterly debated among the Nationalists, between large and small states and North and South. When the Constitutional Convention opened on May 25, 1787, its first act was a foregone conclusion: unanimous selection of George Washington as its presiding officer. It was all too symbolic that Robert Morris was the man to make the nomination. Next came the adoption of voting rules for the convention. The Pennsylvanians had the presumption to urge voting by population, but Virginia, fearing hostility from the small states, vetoed the move, and voting was established as in the Congress. 1 vote per state, and voting by majority of states, a simple majority resolving all issues. Another rule made all votes taken to be permanent, subject to reopening later in the convention. Particularly important was the decision, now and afterward, to hold the entire convention in strictest secrecy, in order to make sure that the public would not know what was going on until the convention presented its conclusions as a fait accompli. Here was a perfect setting for the pursuance of the nationalist design. This secrecy rule, proposed by Pierce Butler of South Carolina, was to be demonized by Thomas Jefferson as abominable. The Virginia delegation arrived early and hammered out a common program. On May 29, Virginia opened proceedings with Governor Edmund Randolph presenting its revolutionary resolutions to the convention, which were written largely by James Madison. Randolph, who had been quickly influenced by Madison on the deficiencies of the Articles, made clear that the Virginia plan was directed against democracy. Randolph conceded, wrote Robert Yates of New York in Alarm, that the proposal was not intended for a federal government. He meant a strong consolidated union, in which the idea of states should be nearly annihilated. Specifically, the Virginians recommended: Number 1, voting in the national legislature to be proportionate to tax revenue or population, rather than by equality of states. Number 2, 2 branches of the national legislature, the lower house to be selected by the people of each state, not by the state legislatures. Number 3, election of the smaller upper house for long terms by the lower house out of persons nominated by the state legislatures. Number 4, Congress to be empowered to legislate in all cases to which the separate states are incompetent, the ramifications to be presumably decided by Congress, and Congress to have veto power over all states which it considered to be inimical to the Confederation, and to force the states to obey. Thus, the rule of the state legislatures were to be enormously reduced to being a pool for nominations for the national upper house. Number 5, establishment of a national executive to be chosen by the Congress, its salary to be fixed and chosen by Congress, and the executive to be limited to a single term. Number 6, a national judiciary of supreme and inferior courts, and with supreme jurisdiction for interstate cases. Number 7, the creation of a council of revision, composed of the executive and some of the national judiciary to examine every act of the legislature, and to exert a veto power over it which could be overridden. Number 8, finally, this government would be submitted by the old Congress, not to state legislatures as under the Articles, but to special state conventions chosen by the people for this purpose. In the course of clarification of their resolutions, it quickly became clear that the Virginians had wanted not a merely federal union, but a national government, consisting of a supreme judicial, legislative, and executive. In short, the Virginians meant political revolution rather than reform of the Articles of Confederation. Gouverneur Morris further clarified the nationalist view. The old federal government was a mere compact resting on the good faith of the parties, while the new national government was to have a complete and compulsive operation. It was these revelations that made Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina and Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts grow restive. This was illegal, revolutionary, and violated the express instructions of Congress and some states to confine themselves to revising the Articles. Pinckney expatiated that the convention should really be at the end, while Gerry called on the delegates to create a federal rather than national legislature, executive, and judiciary. But the convention ignored the protests and fatefully resolved that a national government ought to be established consisting of a supreme legislative, judiciary, and executive. This critical resolution, moved by Pierce Butler of South Carolina, passed by 6-1 to 1. Yes, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. No, Connecticut. Divided, New York between Hamilton for and Yates against. The Virginia plan went into the Committee of the Whole, and the convention spent the next 2 weeks debating it. This was in itself a benefit for the Nationalists because they were able to get from the beginning the frame of reference for the convention's debates. One crucial debate concerned Virginia's demand over proportional representation in Congress, either by population or by contributions of revenue, and the issue of election of congressmen by popular vote. Here had been one of the critical debates in writing the Articles of Confederation a decade before. There were, in fact, two main reasons for the nationalist emphasis on these issues. One was the desire of the populous states to dominate the new government by ensuring that there would be no equality of states voting. In particular, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Massachusetts were anxious to get this dominance as they were the largest states, with nearly half of the American population between them. James Madison of Virginia and James Wilson and Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania led the drive for proportional representation. In contrast, the small states, even the most nationalist of them, were bitter from the start. George Read, a conservative from Delaware, even threatened to lead Delaware out of the convention if the large states insisted on this plan, since the state had instructed their delegates not to change the rule of suffrage. Under the Delaware threat, the convention agreed to postpone the explosive question of proportional representation in Congress. But there was another subtler reason for this nationalist clause, a reason which has again been foreshadowed in the original debates over the Articles. This was the demagogic, supposedly democratic opportunism by the anti-democrats to use popular election of the large house to destroy the power of the state legislatures, which were severely hated by the nationalists as being overly democratic and inimical to a powerful central government. Thus, democracy could be thwarted with this seemingly democratic solution. This clause of popular election of the lower house of Congress was opposed from two directions, by those critical of national government and by anti-democrats, often the same people who didn't understand the intricacies and subtleties of the nationalist machinations. Thus, on the one hand, Roger Sherman of Connecticut demanded continued election of the lower house by the state legislatures. Otherwise, state governments would be critically weakened by the national government. On the other hand, Sherman, the South Carolinians, and Elbridge Gerry, frankly frightened by the Shayside Rebellion, warned of the evils of popular election in Congress. The idea of direct popular election of Congress was defended by George Mason, a liberal who didn't grasp the nationalist designs. Answering Gerry and Sherman, Mason simply defended such an elected lower house as the grand oppository of the democratic principle of the government. James Madison, who did understand what was going on, shrewdly provided lip service to the necessity of popular election of one legislative branch, as essential to every plan of free government. But then he revealed the purpose of the plan by assuming that popular elections would be refined by successive filtrations, and that such filtrations of the Senate or the upper house, the judiciary, and the executive would effectively place the all-powerful national government beyond popular control. The even franker James Wilson laid bare the Machiavellian design of the Nationalists. Popular election of the House would free the national government from state control, and thus raise the federal pyramid to a considerable altitude, by giving it as broad a basis as possible. Thus, national power could really be removed from more popular control, while at the same time popular election would mislead the people into placing their necessary confidence in the government. For no government could long subsist without the confidence of the people. In a Republican government, this confidence was peculiarly essential. Wilson added that a large-scale government would naturally give this confidence because of the vainglory of the masses. The people, he supposed, would be rather more attached to the national government than to the state governments, as being more important in itself and more flattering to their pride. Furthermore, any danger from excessive democracy could be met by making the elective districts large, and therefore remote from control by the people themselves. One amusing incident occurred when George Read, exasperated at John Dickinson of Delaware's wish to allow some room for the states in the American system, revealed his eagerness to see the total abolition of the states. We must look beyond their continuance. A national government must soon of necessity swallow all of them up. They will soon be reduced to the mere office of electing the National Senate. Read attributed any reluctance to interested men in state governments. James Wilson, alarmed at Read's imprudent frankness, hastened to assure everyone that the states would not be abandoned. In fact, they might well remain, provided they were restrained to certain local purposes. With Read refusing to take the hint and repeating his pronouncements, it is doubtful that Wilson's attempt to soothe proved much comfort for the few liberals present. Finally, after lengthy debate, the convention voted, on June 6th, to elect the lower house of Congress by the people rather than by the state legislatures. The vote was 8-3. The three objecting were Connecticut, New Jersey, and South Carolina. In the course of the debate on this question, Madison returned to the scene with a general defense of the concept of strong central government. In what is surely one of the most specious and overrated arguments for wide-ranging government ever provided, and foreshadowing his argument in the Federalist No. 10, Madison insisted that one of the main purposes of government was to defend the rights of various types of minorities. To do so, the bigger and farther-reaching government, the better. For then it would be difficult for any one majority to form out of the great multiplicity of minority interests. As Madison put it, where a majority are united by a common sentiment and have an opportunity, the rights of the minor party become insecure. In a Republican government, the majority, if united, have always an opportunity. The only remedy is to enlarge the sphere, and thereby divide the community into so great a number of interests and parties that, in the first place, a majority will not be likely at the same moment to have a common interest, and in the second place, they may not be apt to unite in pursuit of it. It should be evident that first, coalitions to form a majority are not very difficult, and second, the centralizing of power into one large juggernaut provides far more of an opportunity and more of an incentive for trampling the rights of minorities. The stakes are larger and restraints weaker, not greater, because power is concentrated and consolidated. On the contrary, it is the fragmentation of power into many small local units that is likely to make oppression of minorities more difficult. Furthermore, minorities tend to have more control in smaller political units, since they are more likely to have effective representation in them. In other words, the smaller the political unit, the harder it is for any one minority to coerce another, and the greater control each minority has. In fact, Madison's real argument here was worded in deceptive language. What Madison and his fellow nationalists were really anxious to secure were the rights of minorities against the majority, or more specifically, oligarchical rule by a specialized minority at the expense of the majority. What central government power made easier was just such minority rule, for central government was both stronger and more remote from the knowledge, vigilance, and control of the people. The larger the scope and strength of government indeed, the more difficult it is for a knowledgeable majority to form and unite to rise up against its remote oligarchical and bureaucratic rule. The unrealism of Madison's theory can be seen from the only true examples which were given of supposed majorities trampling over the minority that made strong central government necessary. Debtors have defrauded their creditors. The landed interest has borne hard on the mercantile interest. But the reality of the 1780s was that the landed farmers were being oppressed by the public debt and tax structure imposed by merchant public creditors, and that such attempts as Shays' Rebellion to break off their yoke were one of the important factors in pushing the Nationalists to form the Constitutional Convention. In short, strong centrist government was partly devised to reimpose the minority mercantilist yoke upon the majority, which was being thwarted in some of the states. The next critical debate was over the upper house or the Senate, which Virginia had proposed to have elected by the lower house of Congress, thus assuring large state nationalist domination of the Senate as well as the House. Here the resistance was too great, and only Massachusetts and South Carolina backed the Virginia plan. James Wilson insisted on crushing the states completely by also electing the Senate according to popular vote, while George Read was by far the most reactionary in advocating the executive appointment of senators from members of state legislatures. John Dickinson protested that he opposed any attempt to abolish the states altogether. The result on June 7 was unanimous agreement to have senators selected by the separate state legislatures. Thus, by early June, the convention had decided on election of the lower house of Congress by the people of various states, and election of the senators by the state legislatures. But one critical point about the representation had yet to be settled: how many representatives would be granted to each state. This struggle had been postponed when the Delaware delegates threatened to walk out should representation be proportionate, as in the Virginia plan, to population in the apportionment of both houses of Congress. Chapter 15. The Nature of National Power. At the end of May, the convention approved with little debate the severely national power granted to Congress, including the absolute power to act when it deemed the states to be incompetent, and to veto all state laws it held to violate the Constitution or any national treaties, a device added by Benjamin Franklin. Charles Pinckney, John Rutledge, and Pierce Butler of South Carolina expressed worry over the sweeping nature of congressional power. Randolph rather ingeniously denied any intention to destroy state power, while Madison held that broad national consolidation would override any contrary wishes for a limited enumeration of power. For his part, James Wilson asserted brusquely that it would be impossible to enumerate the powers which the federal legislature ought to have. Its power must, in short, be boundless. Finally, the convention granted Congress the absolute power to act whenever states were not competent, by a vote of 9-0 to 1. Only Connecticut failed to agree due to the actions of Roger Sherman. Madison did opportunistically prefer an amendment of the clause authorizing force against the states, because force, Madison correctly observed, would look more like a declaration of war than an infliction of punishment. Extended discussion did arise, however, over the nature of executive power. What specific form should it take? Should it, for example, be single or plural? Predictably, the ultra-nationalists, led by James Wilson, Charles Pinckney, and John Rutledge, urged a single executive, which would concentrate the most power and be closest to an American monarchy. Roger Sherman urgently insisted, in opposition, that the executive was only an instrument for carrying out the will of the legislature, and therefore the members of the executive should be left to the discretion of Congress. Edmund Randolph passionately warned that a single executive would be a fetus of monarchy. He suggested instead a plural three-way executive. Randolph insisted that he would be opposed to a single executive as long as he lived. The permanent temper of the people, Randolph warned, was adverse to the very semblance of monarchy. To this, Wilson and the other ultranationalists hastened to assure the convention that there was no resemblance whatever to the British monarchy. Wilson's use of dramatic rhetoric toward the necessity of concentrated power was advanced even further by South Carolina's Pierce Butler, who declared that a single executive would in some way be responsible to the whole and would be impartial to its interests. Butler was particularly concerned to have a single impartial executive for conducting military actions. For his part, James Wilson seems to have deplored the use of the alleged devotion of the Founding Fathers at Philadelphia to checks and balances in government. Instead, a plural executive was rejected by him because it allowed for more disagreement, which would have prevented the effective and unchecked actions of the national government. On June 4, the convention faithfully acceded to Wilson's desire for a single executive. The vote was 7-3. New York, Maryland, and Delaware objecting. Virginia's delegation was split 4-3 in favor of Wilson's scheme over its own. George Mason, Edmund Randolph, and John Blair were overruled by Nationalists James Madison, George Wythe, and James McClurg, joined by a rare George Washington tie-breaking vote. James Wilson, on June 1 and 2, continued to promote his emphatically ingenious scheme for the reality of tyranny unopposed in a plebiscitary democratic form. Wilson, in short, called for replacing the Virginia Plan selection of the executive by Congress. Instead, the executive would be chosen directly by the people, voting in state districts to choose electors, who in turn would select the executive. Thus, in the name of popular election, the executive would be removed from its natural dependence in the body making the laws, or the legislature, and exist independently and remotely in its own power base, ostensibly subordinate to the broad public, but in reality removed from effective public control. The insulation from public control was further ensured by the device of the Electoral College, which placed the executive far removed from popular choice. Wilson also repeated his argument for a popular election of the lower house, since only with this would the people truly be inclined to place their confidence in their national rulers. Roger Sherman, as in so many other issues, cogently opposed the ultra-nationalist schemes. Sherman was for the appointment by the legislature and for making him absolutely dependent on that body, as it was the will of that which was to be executed. An independence of the executive on the supreme legislative was in his opinion the very essence of tyranny, if there was any such thing. Finally, Wilson's proposal was beaten down by 8-2, with only Maryland and Pennsylvania in favor. The convention promptly agreed that Congress would elect the single executive for a term of 7 years. Again, the vote was 8-2, with Pennsylvania and Maryland voting no. The lengthy 7-year term, however, was a victory for the Nationalists. It was proposed by Charles Pinckney and attacked by Gunning Bedford of Delaware, who called for a 3-year term. The 7-year clause was passed by the close vote of 5-4-1. Yes, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Virginia. No, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Connecticut. Divided, Massachusetts. The Nationalists won another handful by overwhelmingly crushing an intelligent proposal by John Dickinson, a veteran conservative worried by excessively nationalist trends that the executive be removable by Congress with a majority of the state legislatures. On June 4, the question of the preferred veto power for a council of revision ran into the sensible theory that judges should not be part of a vetoing council because they were also the arbiter of the constitutionality of laws. There was also a remarkable clause pushed by the ultranationalists James Wilson and Alexander Hamilton to give the executive an absolute veto power over Congress, a vast power that they somehow contended would not be too much exercised. Its very existence would preserve harmony and prevent mischief, i.e., it would ensure the subservience of Congress to the supreme will of the executive. Even so strong a nationalist as Pierce Butler balked at this, warning of another Oliver Cromwell, and James Madison felt that the people were not yet ready to give such a prerogative. To meet this new threat by the ultras, George Mason rose to the height of his eloquence and thundered that the executive would be a monarchy even more dangerous than the British because it was elected. Mason hoped that nothing like a monarchy would ever be attempted in this country. A hatred to its oppressions had carried the people through the late Revolution. The Wilson-Hamilton proposal for absolute veto was defeated unanimously by the states. The single executive, however, was given veto power that could only be overridden by 2/3 of each House of Congress. And the veto was vested in him alone and not in a council of revision. The requirements for overriding the veto were so stringent that an elective monarchy in the United States may be said to have been imposed in any case. Who would appoint the judiciary? The Virginia plan's appointment of the Supreme Court by Congress was fought by Wilson, who urged that the executive, a single responsible person, be given the power to appoint the entire judiciary. Again, all power would be concentrated in the president. But this time, John Rutledge balked at the specter of monarchy, and Sherman and Pinckney urged the original Virginia plan. James Madison, however, proposed and carried a compromise for selection of the Supreme Court by the Senate. A particularly severe struggle occurred over the role of the inferior courts. The moderates, led by Rutledge and Sherman, wanted no inferior courts whatever. All original cases could be heard in the state courts, and the federal Supreme Court would then be limited to an appellate role, which would be sufficient to ensure national uniformity. Any structure of federal inferior courts would pose a severe threat to state power and raise the potential for a national dictator. Madison, for several reasons, led the nationalist fight for a body of inferior courts with full jurisdiction in many cases. Thus would the federal judiciary be commensurate to the legislative authority. Rutledge's proposal to eliminate the clause establishing federal inferior courts passed on June 5 by a narrow vote of 5 to 4 to 2. Yes, Connecticut, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. No, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia. Divided, Massachusetts, New York. But just when it seemed that the right had suffered a significant loss, the Nationalists bounced back to capture once more, as in the case of the executive veto power, the essence of their goals at the expense of a slight loss of the form. Wilson and Madison ensured that Congress be empowered, though not compelled, to establish inferior courts, and won by a vote of 8 to 2 to 1. Connecticut and South Carolina being opposed and New York divided. Again, the Nationalists won the essence of their demands. At this early date in the convention, the Nationalists began to hint of their essentially revolutionary design to not submit the new Constitution as a legal amendment to the Articles. Roger Sherman objected to the Virginia Plan idea of submitting their decisions to state conventions with the consent of Congress. Why not ratify them in the state legislatures? Madison fell back on the Wilsonian pseudo-democratic rhetoric, while Rufus King let slip the real reason for the sudden accession of democratic form by the Nationalists. A convention being a single house, the adoption may more easily be carried through it than through the legislatures where there are several branches. The legislatures, also being to lose power, will be most likely to raise objections. In other words, there was no chance of ratification in the state legislatures, and the electors chosen by state conventions could be more easily persuaded. After the convention was softened up with this skirting with illegality, James Wilson offered a truly subversive direction. Why allow the bulk of the states to be blocked by the inconsiderate or selfish opposition of a few states? Why not just choose ratification after only a certain number of states, Pinckney helpfully supporting 9? This issue was postponed by the possibly stunned assemblage, with no comment made on this blunt proposal to scrap the unanimity proposal of the existing Confederation. Thus, by June 7, the Nationalists, though forced to make a few concessions, had so far carried the substance of their program: the creation of a supreme national government and a Congress empowered to act whenever it thought the states were incompetent to veto any state laws it felt threatened the Constitution or national treaties, though it was not empowered to coerce the states. An independent and powerful single executive chosen by Congress for 7 years, with a nearly absolute veto power over Congress. A national supreme judiciary appointed by the Senate, and a system of inferior courts established by Congress and appointed by the President. The judges all to be appointed for life terms. A bicameral Congress, with the lower house elected by the people, and the Constitution would be submitted to state conventions rather than legislatures, and potentially secured through a union of 9 states rather than by unanimous ratification. The election of senators in the upper house by state legislatures was the only substantial setback so far for the nationalist cause. On June 8, the exultant nationalists moved to further augment the central power even more. Congress had already been given the absolute power of vetoing state laws deemed to be unconstitutional or in violation of national treaties. Now, the emboldened nationalists moved to crush the states altogether, as Charles Pinckney proposed that Congress have the absolute power to veto all state laws whatsoever. James Madison seconded with an impassioned plea for such total power as absolutely necessary to a perfect system. In fact, the absolute veto was the least that could be done. James Wilson's frenzy was, predictably, even greater as he thundered that, "We are now one nation of brethren. We must bury all local interests and distinctions." The opposition to all this fire-eating was weak. Once again, the liberals and moderates were stymied by their agreement with the fundamental tendency and direction of the nationalists, though not with the length to which the ultranationalists pushed the logic of their views. Only Gunning Bedford delivered an opposition of any force or spirit. Bedford spoke up for the several states in danger of being crushed by the advancing juggernaut of Pennsylvania and Virginia, who wished to provide a system in which they would have an enormous and monstrous influence. Yet the Pinckney proposal for a universal congressional veto over the states was defeated by the tremendous margin of 7-3-1. Voting for the nationalist dream, indeed, were precisely the 3 big states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Virginia's delegation was again split, Mason and Randolph objecting, while McClurg and Blair followed Madison's lead. Delaware was the divided state, and the conservatives Reed and Dickinson were blocked by Bedford and Richard Bassett. Chapter 16. The Debate over Representation in Congress. The stage was now set for one of the great titanic struggles of the Philadelphia Convention, the postponed question of the nature of representation in Congress, and specifically on the Virginia plan of proportional representation. William Patterson and David Brearley of New Jersey took the occasion to launch a full-scale counterattack on the large state nationalist junto. Brearley opened by pointing to the convenient solution of the question that had already been hammered out in the formulation of the Articles: equal voting by each state. Only in that way could the smaller states avoid being surrounded by Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Patterson was even more pointed, sternly reminding the convention that the express object was to amend the Confederation, and that the Articles of Confederation were therefore the proper basis of all the proceedings of the convention. We ought to keep within its limits, or we should be charged by our constituents with usurpation. The people of America are sharp-sighted and not to be deceived. The idea of a national government as contradistinguished from a federal one never entered into the mind of any. We have no power to go beyond the federal scheme, and if we had, the people are not ripe for any other. Patterson also threatened that Wilson's hint at a new national confederation of states would not include the small state of New Jersey, which would never accept the proportional representation plan of American nationalism. If representation was to be proportional, then some specific plan would have to be selected. On June 11, Roger Sherman proposed a significant compromise: that the House be chosen in proportion to the respective number of free persons, while the Senate consist of 1 vote per state. In this way, the lower house would be chosen on a national basis, elected by the people to their number, while the Senate would be chosen equally by the state legislatures. Immediately, the issue arose of the kind of proportional representation in the lower house. John Rutledge and Pierce Butler urged representation proportional to the revenue supplied by each state. As Butler put it with unmatched candor, money was power, and that the states ought to have weight in the government, in proportion to their wealth. By a vote of 7-3-1, the convention then affirmed some principles of representation for the lower house, as opposed to equality of states. New York, New Jersey, and Delaware voted no, while Maryland was divided. It was at this point that a fateful issue was injected into the proceedings: slavery. For if the proportion was to be according to population, the South wanted slaves included in the population figures. Wilson and Pinckney proposed that the proportion of each state in the lower house include every free person, including bondservants, plus 3/5 of all other persons except Indians. Wilson's excuse was that Congress had already recommended, and 11 states had approved, that revenue quotas under the Articles would be so apportioned. A specious argument, since levying taxes and granting representation are scarcely the same thing. In addition, as Luther Martin told the Maryland legislature, taxing slaves discouraged slavery, while giving them political representation encouraged it. At this juncture, there was very little debate, and only Elbridge Gerry cogently pointed out that if the slaves were property, there is no more reason to represent them than the cattle and horses of the North. In the vote, the 3/5 clause was approved by no less than 9 states to 2. Only New Jersey and Delaware, the champions of the small states, voting against. The next order of business was the Senate. Roger Sherman, seconded by Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, made a very strong plea for each state to have one vote in the Senate, implicitly adding Connecticut's withdrawal threat to Delaware and New Jersey's. Sherman warned that everything he said depended on this. The smaller states would never agree to the plan on any other principle than an equality of suffrage in this branch. It has been remarked that it was with this touchy issue of representation in Congress that tempers began to flare and withdrawals threatened. Yet, despite Sherman's stringent plea, the vote for equal state voting in the Senate was rejected, and a Wilson-Hamilton motion for the same method of apportionment as in the lower house was approved by the same closest of margins, 6-5. The votes were, for equal voting by states, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. For proportional voting as in the House, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. In short, the small states and New York for equal voting. The large northern states plus the slaveholding South for the large state nationalist plan of proportional representation. We may now pause to consider the question: why did such smaller states as North Carolina, South Carolina, and the really small state of Georgia, and often joined by Maryland, take the large state view, and also their victory? A Georgia or a South Carolina might be a nationalist for many reasons, but why generally a large state nationalist? The answer is that these southern states, in which slavery played an integral role in the economy and society, expected the slaves to multiply in population and soon outweigh the North. Already, the slave states were almost on a population parity with the predominantly free states, and the lands approximately ready for settlement were the Southwest, where Kentucky and Tennessee were already expanding rapidly, while the unsettled North was commanded by British Army forts. Evidence of great expectations abounds. Thus, James Madison wrote to Thomas Jefferson during the spring of 1787 that representation by population would be adopted because it would be recommended to the eastern states by the actual superiority of their populousness, and to the southern by their expected superiority. Both South and North agreed on the essentials of the question. Later in the convention, George Mason would look forward to the day as soon as the southern and western population should predominate, which must happen in a few years. And Gouverneur Morris would concede the necessity of accepting the vicious principle of equality in the Senate in order to provide some defense for the North states against a preponderance of southern and western power. After the crucial vote on representation in the Senate, the convention proceeded, by similar close majorities, to vote for referral of the new Constitution to conventions in the various states. Terms of appointment were decided for Congress, and in both cases, the longest of the terms considered were chosen: 3 years for the lower house and 7 for the Senate. Madison led the fight from the Nationalists for long terms, while Gerry argued for annual House elections to provide a popular check on their representatives. The Committee of the Whole had now made up its decision on the Virginia Plan, and the Nationalist triumph was seemingly complete. The committee made its report to the convention on June 13. The Virginia Plan had been essentially adopted whole. A supreme national government, the Congress of which could veto all states it considered unconstitutional and in violation of national treaties. A powerful single executive, chosen for a long term of 7 years by Congress, with a nearly absolute veto power over Congress. A Supreme Court appointed by the Senate, and a system of inferior federal courts authorized, which would be appointed by the President. A bicameral Congress, the lower house elected by the people on the basis of population, including 3/5 of slaves, and an upper house selected by state legislatures on the same basis. The Constitution to be submitted to state conventions after approval by Congress. All this symbolized a total smashing large state nationalist victory. The voting, especially in the close small versus large state conflict, had been made possible by the absence of 2 small states from the convention, Rhode Island, which refused to attend, and New Hampshire, whose delegates had not yet arrived. But the small state nationalist bloc, albeit joined with the liberals, had only begun to fight. To block the acceptance of the Virginia Plan report on June 15, William Patterson outlined the contrasting New Jersey Plan. This last-ditch measure was successful in blocking ready acceptance of the Virginia Plan report on the 13th, and both plans were now referred back to the Committee of the Whole. The New Jersey Plan had been drawn up by a block of members of full delegations from New Jersey and Delaware, who were small state nationalists, and Connecticut and New York, who were liberals and moderates. The plan's main difference from Virginia's was that while it gave greatly increased power to the federal government, it at least tried to maintain the semblance of a confederation, and it gave the smaller states a voice in that confederation. Instead of the Virginia Plan's bicameral legislature, the New Jersey Plan stuck with the current confederation's unicameral legislature, and each state had only 1 vote. The federal government also had no veto power over state legislation. There was a federal judiciary and a plural federal executive. And while the latter had no command of the army, it had the power to call forth the Confederation and enforce and compel an obedience to congressional laws and treaties. It was at this point that Alexander Hamilton decided to get into the act. Outnumbered by his own delegation, Hamilton was, rather surprisingly, not playing a leading role in a convention he had been instrumental in promulgating. And besides, from his extensive position on the ultra-right, he was getting restive at the meager concessions to liberals that he saw being made. Hence, with more than one constitutional plan now being offered, on June 18, Hamilton presented his own. Reviewing briefly the history of federal unions, Greece, Germany, Switzerland, Hamilton quickly concluded that federalism was hopelessly weak and ineffective, and that therefore we must establish a general and national government, completely sovereign, and annihilate the state distinctions and state operations. Deploring even republicanism in itself, Hamilton pointed uncritically to the British monarchical government as the model for American framers to follow. Attacking the masses of the people as turbulent and changing, and filled with fervor, Hamilton called upon the convention to give to the few who are the rich and the well-born a permanent share in national power. In a bizarre non sequitur, Hamilton maintained that making the rich and well-born into a national ruling class would most assuredly give them a vested interest in the system, and they therefore will ever maintain good government. Only such a permanent ruling class could check the imprudence of democracy. Indeed, no democratically elected executive, even as conservative a one as under the Virginia Plan, can be of any value. Only the British-style executive will at all suffice. The nationalistic Virginia Plan in general did not go far enough in increasing the power of the government, for it was but pork still with a little change of the sauce. Pushing for what was in effect an elective, powerful monarchy, Hamilton called for a national executive elected for life, and one moreover who dares execute his powers. The executive to be elected remotely from the public by electors chosen in the various states. Hamilton also urged a Senate elected for life, also independently by electors. In Hamilton's dream state, there were to be no restrictions whatsoever on the absolute power of the central government, The Congress was to have the unlimited power of passing all laws without exception, and the executive to have absolute veto power. Also, an executive office in each state would be appointed by the president with absolute power to veto all state laws, and all militia officers were to be appointed by the national government. In addition to a Supreme Court, Congress was to appoint inferior courts in every state, so as to make the state governments unnecessary. Alexander Hamilton had conclusively described the matter for his dream state, his ideal polity, and no clearer blueprint could have been devised for absolute despotism. Significantly enough, one of the reasons given by Hamilton in the alleged necessity of replacing the Confederation with a strong national government was the weaknesses of the war power. Under the Confederation, the military was weak, and it is evident they, the Confederation, can raise no troops nor equip vessels before war is actually declared. It has often been insisted that one of the major impulses behind the nationalist drive was a desire to replace the foreign policy of the United States under the strictly limited government of the Confederation with an aggressive foreign policy along the model of all great powers. The Hamilton speech struck the members of the convention with the force of a thunderclap. To the liberals and moderates, this was the corporeal embodiment of their fears of the nationalist designs. To his fellow counter-revolutionaries, Hamilton's candor was a terrible indiscretion, a mighty embarrassment, the imprudent revelation of all their fantasies they knew could not be achieved. As Professor Miller writes, with good reason therefore, Madison exclaimed that Hamilton was up to his old trick of letting the cat out of the bag, and this time the cat was a particularly ugly specimen that seemed quite capable of breaking up the convention. Madison and Wilson rushed to denounce Hamilton's plan, both of them hyperactively assuring everyone that they were deeply devoted to preserving the rights and powers of the states, these absolutely necessary institutions. Hamilton himself added that he did not exactly want to abolish the states altogether, only to make them mere administrative subdivisions of the national government. Hardly an explanation calculated to soothe the feelings of the moderates. Only the highly conservative George Read of all the delegates subscribed with enthusiasm to Hamilton's idea. Indeed, he went even a step further to urge the obliteration of even the states as administrative subdivisions, and then representation by eventually new administrative districts. The nationalist disapproval, however, killed the Hamilton plan completely. The convention's Committee of the Whole turned to consider the New Jersey plan. James Madison delivered the large state nationalist attack. Example, a newly revised articles would not prevent the states from violating national treaties, would not ensure good state laws, and did not supply sufficient force to suppress state insurrections such as Shays' Rebellion. After Madison's speech on June 19, the convention voted 7-3-1 to reject the New Jersey plan in favor of the agreed Virginia plan. Voting to scrap the New Jersey plan for the Virginia plan, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Voting against scrapping, New York, New Jersey, Delaware. Maryland was divided. The Virginia plan was now before the full convention as the basis for further work. Each clause of the plan would now again be taken up in turn. On the initial first clause of the Virginia plan to establish a supreme national government, Wilson, Hamilton, and King argued in favor, Wilson being careful to absolve himself from Hamilton's design. Luther Martin of Maryland cogently set forth the state sovereignty position. The separation from GB placed the 13 states in a state of nature towards each other, that they would have remained in that state till this time, but for the Confederation, that they entered into the Confederation on the footing of equality, that they met now to amend it on the same footing, and that he could never accede to a plan that would introduce an inequality and lay 10 states at the mercy of Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania. To this argument, Wilson and Hamilton replied with another one of their ingenious fancies, that somehow the Declaration of Independence meant that the states became independent first as united and not as separate entities. As a semantic concession to the moderates proposed by Oliver Ellsworth, the word national was replaced throughout by the United States. But the supremacy of the central government, the real point of this clause, remained. The next point was a bicameral Congress, and here the liberal-moderate bloc counterattacked strongly. A remarkable development, since at the end of May, this clause had passed almost unanimously in the Committee of the Whole. On behalf of the Confederation, John Lansing of New York moved that Congress shall consist of a single body. George Mason of Virginia delivered a speech against, but Lansing was supported by Roger Sherman and Luther Martin. The vote on June 20 was surprisingly close, and Lansing's motion for a unicameral Congress was defeated by only 4 to 6 to 1. Yes, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware. No, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Divided, Maryland. The bicameral clause was adopted the next day by 7 to 3 to 1, Connecticut switching its vote from the day before. Next came the question whether the lower house of Congress would be elected by the people. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina led the attempt to throw out this clause and revert to the election by the state legislatures. Hamilton led the defense of this key part in the Nationalist program, but only Connecticut, New Jersey, and Delaware joined South Carolina in supporting election of the lower house by the state legislatures. And only New Jersey, with Maryland divided, held out to the last against popular election of the lower house. The convention did agree, however, to lower the congressional term from 3 to 2 years. The next clause of the Virginia Plan was the selection of the Senate by the state legislatures, one of the few concessions that the Nationalists had been forced to make in the Committee of the Whole. Until now, the division of the states had not precisely been small versus large. It had rather been the South plus the 2 large states of the North, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, against the smaller states of the North. Now, on June 25 came the first purely sectional split of the convention. A motion to postpone consideration of the Senate until the 3/5 clause of representation in the House was settled mobilized the 5 slave states, the South from Maryland to Georgia, in favor of postponement, and the 6 northern states opposed. The Nationalists, led by James Wilson, launched an assault to reverse their concession and elect the Senate by electors chosen by people in the several states. The convention, however, voted overwhelmingly to keep the concession of election by state legislatures. Only the ultra-nationalist delegation from Pennsylvania and Virginia voted no. The term of senators was then taken up, the moderates arguing for a shorter term than 7 years, to provide a popular check on the senators, and the reactionaries arguing for longer terms for the opposite reason. In a sense, the debate turned not so much on whether the proposed term should be lengthened from 7 years to 9, or down to 6 or 4, as to where the major threat to liberty laid. Madison, leading the 9-year proponents, trumpeted again on his formulaic theories and warned of the evils of majority rule, specifically the suffrage of the mass of the poor. In short, Madison and his nationalist cohort saw the main dangers to liberty in the people, and wished to build up an even stronger oligarchical rule in central government to exert power against the menace of the people. In this aim, Madison was backed by Wilson and Reed, while Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris argued life terms for the senators. On the other hand, the liberals located the major threat to liberty precisely in the oligarchical threat the Nationalists were happy to fasten over the people. The way to guard against the danger of government was to weaken the oligarchy and bureaucracy, and multiply popular checks upon the rulers. Here indeed was the basic political issue between left and right in the United States. Thus, Roger Sherman, in the course of this debate, eloquently declared, "Government is instituted for those who live under it. It ought therefore to be so constituted as not to be dangerous to their liberties. The more permanency it has, the worse if it be a bad government. Frequent elections are necessary to preserve the good behavior of the rulers." James Wilson, in his speech for lengthening the Senate terms, raised an interesting point. for it showed the importance that the Nationalists gave to foreign affairs and to an aggressive foreign policy designed to aid merchants in pursuing their trade. Wilson asserted that, since the Senate will have the power to make wars and treaties, it ought therefore to be made respectable in the eyes of foreign nations. The true reason why Great Britain has not yet listened to a commercial treaty with us has been because she had no confidence in the stability or efficacy of our government. 9 years with a rotation will provide these desirable qualities. After hearing the importance of the various arguments, the actual voting was another climactic event. The convention voted not to extend Senate terms to 9 years, and to cut the term to 6. Only Pennsylvania and Virginia, joined by Delaware, voted to extend. To cut to 6 years, many Nationalists decided to vote for, while 4 states, New York, New Jersey, South Carolina, Georgia, held out for a still shorter term. The decision for 6 years scarcely differed from the reported Virginia plan. It was on June 27 that the convention reached the most fateful point of all, on which acrimony had spread and walkouts had been threatened: the apportionment of voting in the 2 branches of Congress. Luther Martin led a lengthy assault on proportional representation in the lower house. The separate states were still sovereign, said Martin, and had not abdicated. Furthermore, an equal vote in each state was essential to the federal idea. Acrimony over the debate mounted so alarmingly that Benjamin Franklin at one point frantically called for a turn to religion and prayer to seek a solution. At one point in the debate on June 29, Dr. William Samuel Jackson of Connecticut resurrected a compromise made earlier by his Connecticut colleague Roger Sherman, that the upper house of Congress have equal representation by each state, while the lower house be elected by proportional representation. But Madison, Hamilton, Gerry, and the Nationalists would have none of this. Madison declared frankly that the states ought to be placed under the control of the general government, at least as much so as they formerly were under the King and British Parliament. Finally, in one of the fateful votes of the convention, the body voted on June 29 to establish suffrage in the lower house by some proportionate ratio, and not by the equality of the Articles of Confederation. The vote was very close, 6 to 4 to 1. Yes, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. No, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware. Divided, Maryland. Once again, the lineup was Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and the South against the rest. The convention now came to an issue even more crucial than the previous one: the pattern of representation in the Senate. Until this point, the Virginia plan, as represented by the Committee of the Whole, had been scarcely changed in any respect. But now the frantic liberals, moderates, and small state nationalists opened a desperate assault on the planned selection of senators, also by proportional representation. Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut made a strong plea for equality of voting as basic in the Connecticut Compromise scheme, and he trenchantly warned that no state north of Pennsylvania but Massachusetts would accept proportional representation in both branches of Congress. But the large state nationalists were brutally adamant. James Wilson took the tactic that this separation of the states might just as well be made. Sneering at the states and their very existence, Wilson refused to accede to such a supposedly pernicious system of representation, where a minority could rule the majority. Wilson, however, did use the effective argument that governments were made for men, not for imaginary beings called states. While joining Wilson in worrying about the rights of the national majority being destroyed by a minority, Madison added a shrewd, if overdrawn, point. The real struggle was not so much small state versus large, but by other circumstances, principally from the effects of their having or not having slaves. The great division of interests in the United States did not lie between the large and small states. It lay between the northern and southern. For his part, Rufus King of Massachusetts threatened a breakup of the convention and declared his absolute refusal to come under a government founded in a vicious principle of representation, i.e., equality of voting by states. Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey promptly attacked King's argument, and Luther Martin of Maryland insisted that he could never accept federation on an unjust principle, inequality of voting. The small state leader Gunning Bedford of Delaware then asserted that there was no middle way between a perfect consolidation and a mere confederacy of the states. Bedford also insisted that the large states bloc include those states that would soon become large: Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. These large states, Bedford pointed out, were trying to oppress the small, and their power will be abused. Bedford trenchantly declared, "I do not, gentlemen, trust you." If you possess the power, the abuse of it could not be checked. And what then would prevent you from exercising it to our destruction? Bedford concluded with a counter-threat of his own. Should the large states separate from the small, then the small ones will find some foreign ally of more honor and good faith, who will take them by the hand and do them justice. Never had the convention been closer to permanent split and dissolution, which now seemed imminent. At this point, Alexander Hamilton, discouraged, his plan dismissed, and his vote continually overruled in his own delegation, left for home. On July 2nd, Ellsworth moved that each state be allowed one vote in the Senate. On this crucial vote, the convention split evenly, 5-1. Voting yes, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland. No, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Georgia was the surprise. It divided between Abraham Baldwin, aye, and William Houston, nay. In a very real sense, it was this young Western Georgia lawyer Baldwin who saved the Constitutional Convention and the new Constitution. For without his switch vote, the equality of states would have lost, the small states would have walked out, and the Constitution would not have been formed, or if formed, never ratified. At this point, it should have been clear that the alternative was either something like the Connecticut Compromise or dissolution. Yet the supposedly level-headed practical framers and moderates of the convention, Madison, Wilson, Washington, and Hamilton, were bitterly opposed to any such compromise as destructive of their basic nationalist design. General Charles Cotesworth Pinckney of South Carolina moved to create a committee from each state to propose a compromise. Not only did the Nationalists lose in their opposition to Pinckney's proposal, but the composition of the committee spelled an anti-large state nationalist triumph. Of the members, only Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts was a moderate large state nationalist, while the committee included such staunch small state leaders as William Paterson, Gunning Bedford, and Oliver Ellsworth. Liberals such as Luther Martin and Robert Yates, and such compromisers as Abraham Baldwin of Georgia, William Davie of North Carolina, John Rutledge, George Mason, and Benjamin Franklin. No such major ultra-nationalist leaders such as Madison and Wilson were included on this committee. The committee had been handed the problem of representation in both the Senate and House, and on July 5 it delivered its report. The committee recommended equal voting by states in the Senate and proportional voting by population in the House, and one congressman for every 40,000 people, including 3/5 of the number of slaves, with a minimum of one representative for each state. Here indeed was a threat to the large state nationalist bloc, for their cherished principle of proportional representation in both houses was abandoned. In the height of this blow, the committee's concession of allowing the House to originate all money bills and leaving the Senate unable to mend them was scarcely any consolation to their designs. To this compromise, the large state nationalists were adamantly opposed, and Madison launched the attack with a bitter rejection of departing from justice by granting equality in the upper house. Madison made clear that he would rather split the Union and form a separate nation with the large states, and simply let the small ones exist as best they could. In this, Madison displayed not the broad flexible nature of the compromiser that has often been attributed to him, but rather the rule or ruin tactician of the hardline ultranationalist, who settled for nothing less than total victory and was willing to see the Union dissolve rather than give up his program. Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania was even blunter. Grandiosely designating himself as a representative of the whole human race, Morris urged the large states to go ahead heedless of the public opinion, which could not be known anyways, and the smaller states would have to go along, whether by persuasion or by force. For this country must be united. If persuasion does not unite it, the sword will. Returning to the attack in a second speech, Morris thundered that the compromise failed to protect the aggregate interest of the whole. In particular, contended Morris, he had seen no provision for supporting the dignity and splendor of the American empire. For the states, Morris would just as soon see all the charters and constitutions of the states thrown into the fire and all their demagogues into the ocean. James Wilson joined his fellow nationalists in demanding their version of justice and right, while Gary and Sherman argued meekly for compromise. And small state nationalist William Patterson was more impressive in opposing the large state nationalists. In the midst of the debate, the convention entered a complex and equally significant and bitter struggle over the lower house of Congress. If it was argued that representation there would be proportional, the next logical question was, proportional to what? Gouverneur Morris now moved to push the convention into an even more reactionary stance than what had been reflected in the Virginia Plan, to make representation proportional not only to the number of people, but also to wealth. Morris conjoined wealth and power and maintained that life and liberty were not nearly as important as property. Life and liberty, he speciously declared, were better defended in the savage state. The purpose of society and government was only to secure property. Therefore, property had to be represented in government. Morris also brusquely declared that the Atlantic states should be secured in a fixed domination over the national government, over new and future Western states. Morris was supported in this call for dominance by wealth and seacoast, by King, Gary, and the South Carolina coastal planter delegation. This question was referred to a committee of 5, headed by Morris, which reported on July 9 for appointment by wealth and number. The committee proposed an initial house based vaguely on such an ambition, and warned that the Virginia Plan's apportionment of 1 representation for every 40,000 would make Congress too large and would soon give dominance to the Western states. The committee recommended that Western representation be doled out in safe proportions. To replace these vague injunctions, a new committee under Rufus King was appointed, which recommended an apportionment based on the 3/5 slave clause, and even more than 3/5 for slaves. The slavery issue was by now in the thick of the debate over representation in the lower house, and here North and South squabbled bitterly. King declared that he was fully convinced that the question concerning a difference of interests did not lie where it had hitherto been discussed, between the great and small states, but between the Southern and Eastern. Therefore, he had been ready to make concessions in the proposed national apportionment to the South, concessions which some in the South, such as Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, did not think sufficient. The Northern surrender to the slave states was at the heart of the new American Constitution, and the concession on house apportionment was one of the crucial elements in that surrender. King, at the heart of this concession, was later to declare that the 3/5 clause was at the time believed to be a great one, and has proved to have been the greatest which was made to secure the adoption of the Constitution. In a speech at the convention, King shined great light on the reason for this meek submission to a system which everyone in the North abhorred. The reason was economic interest. If the Northern states expect those preferential distinctions in commerce and other advantages, which they will derive from the connection, they must not expect to receive them without allowing some advantages in return. At the same time, William Patterson attacked the very idea of slave representation. Slaves are only property of the masters. They have no free choice or personal liberty, and consequently are not represented in the Southern state legislatures. So why then in the Congress? Furthermore, this would constitute an encouragement to the slave trade. In a reply, Madison cynically suggested his own pro-large state, pro-slavery state compromise, that the House represent all free people in proportion to their number, and that the Senate represent the nation in proportion to everyone, free and slave. The King Committee suggestion was agreed to on July 10 by 9-2, only South Carolina and Georgia holding out for even more concessions to slavery, while the other southern states were already content with the apportionment concession. But now the future, as well as the initial allocation of votes in the lower house, had to be decided. Accordingly, Edmund Randolph of Virginia and Hugh Williamson of North Carolina suggested the next logical step: that federal censuses be taken periodically on the population of the various states, and that apportionment in the House be periodically updated to account for free white inhabitants plus 3/5 of the slaves. This was no more than the logical step, but for some reason now the northern consciences began to balk. Of course, this balking period was produced by the universal expectation that southern slave state population would continue in the future to expand, and at a much faster pace than the North. Thus, periodic revision would mean accelerating Southern predominance in the national government. But now the arguments of the beleaguered Northerners could only be very weak indeed. The only thing they could say was that the Congress, in its wisdom, should be free to set its own representation. Example: Sherman, Gouverneur Morris. And this was clearly unsatisfactory. And Morris's remonstrance was highly unbearable to the demagoguery of James Madison. For here was Morris urging representation by population, yet trying defiantly to weaken future representation of the southern western population. Madison frankly declared that Morris must have determined the human character by the points of the compass. The Randolph-Williamson census plan was subject to 2 amendments from the right. The ultra-slavery forces headed by Pierce Butler and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney demanded equal representation for slaves and free men, a proposal beaten down on July 11 by 3-7. The only states in favor were Delaware, South Carolina, and Georgia. New York's Lansing and Yates had left the convention for good the previous night, in disgust at the agreement for proportional representation in the House, and charged it was a nationalist conspiracy they would have nothing to do with. This was one of the great fateful errors at the convention, for while they were there, the New Yorkers had much to gain and nothing to lose by staying in the convention. They could have used their states' votes to weaken the Constitution's power as much as possible, and then refused to sign it at the end. The loss of New York deprived the liberal anti-federalists of what little precious vote they had at the convention. The next move from the right was John Rutledge's motion to put wealth back in as a factor in representation along with number, a motion frankly designed by Rutledge to suppress the potential rise of the western states. Rutledge's plan lost by a tie vote of 5-5, South Carolina and Georgia being joined by Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Staunchly opposed were Connecticut, New Jersey, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina. The convention then agreed by a margin of only 6-4 that a periodic census should be made of the free inhabitants. Then came the vital 3/5 clause for slaves, and on this fateful vote, the 3/5 clause was defeated by 4-6. For this clause were all the southern states, except South Carolina holding out for parity, and including Connecticut, were willing to compromise. Opposed were all the northern states and Maryland. It now looked as if the convention would fall apart on both issues of representation in the Senate and the House. The next day, Gouverneur Morris softened the blow of representation by population and wealth by requesting that direct taxation, example land and poll taxes, be in proportion to a state's representation. This apparent softening, however, also meant that the poorer and soon more populous western states would be reluctant to claim their full representation, because it would subject them to greater taxation. At this point, William R. Davie of North Carolina bitterly attacked the elimination of the 3/5 clause, and threatened a walkout if slaves were not to be represented by at least 3/5 in the Congress. Davie proposed a light slap at the slave states by imposing direct taxation in proportion to a state's representation, in order to win back the 3/5 clause. The new climate of opinion led by Ellsworth of Connecticut managed to reverse the convention's decision, and on July 12 it approved the 3/5 rule, including the direct taxation clause. The vote for the whole clause, including the 3/5 rule, was now 6-2 to 2. Pennsylvania and Maryland's vote switched from no to yes, and South Carolina and Massachusetts from no to divided. Now that the South had won on the 3/5 clause, there was no need to insert a wealth clause for representation. Indeed, the coming Western slave states were expected to be relatively poor. The large state nationalists like Randolph, Madison, and Wilson had always opposed anything but population as the standard for representation, and the convention unanimously agreed to drop wealth, only Delaware was divided, and return to the original Virginia plan of apportionment by population only, including 3/5 of slaves, and updated by periodic censuses. Gouverneur Morris, resisting to the end the elimination of wealth as a factor in representation, threatened breakup of the convention and a separate Northern Confederation. Above all, the basis of mere population led Morris to adopt the vicious principle of equality of voting in the Senate to protect the supposedly eventual smaller population of the North against Southern and Western discrimination. Attention returned to the problem of the Senate on whether to accept the previous vote of equality of votes in that branch. With Luther Martin of Maryland and Jonathan Dayton of New Jersey adamantly insisting on equality, the provision was counterattacked bitterly by Wilson, Madison, King, and Pinckney. King reflected the large state nationalists' vehemence in urging this offense to justice and declared that he preferred the doing of nothing to an allowance of an equal vote to all the states. And Wilson and Madison maintained similar views. Madison also raised the point that states' equality would benefit the relatively smaller state non-slave North as against the slave South. Finally, on July 16, the convention voted on the Senate problem. In a very close vote, equality of state voting in the Senate was approved by 5 to 4 to 1. Voting for state equality, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, North Carolina. Opposed, Pennsylvania, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia. Massachusetts was divided. Gary and Caleb Strong for, King and Nathaniel Gorham no. The Connecticut Compromise was barely approved. Thus were the climactic struggles over representation in the federal government decided, and state equality in the Senate was the very first vote in which the original Virginia plan was significantly attacked. The large state nationalists were incensed by this single rebuff, and some wanted to walk out and form their own nationalistic constitution. But they finally decided to stay in the convention. It was now time to turn from the problem of representation in the central government to the question of the substantive power of that government. Chapter 17. Strengthening the Executive and Judiciary. The Virginia Plan report gave Congress the power to legislate in all cases to which the separate states are incompetent, or in which the harmony of the United States may be interrupted by the exercise of individual legislation. This vague grant of the broadest of powers to the central government was now attacked by Rutledge and Butler of South Carolina, who urged that it be returned to a committee for a specific enumeration, and therefore limitation of powers. For such enumerations, the states decided on a tie vote of 5 to 5, with Connecticut, Maryland, South Carolina, Georgia, and surprisingly Virginia voting for enumeration, and Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Delaware, North Carolina, and surprisingly New Jersey holding out for unlimited power. Hence the recommittal lost. The pressure of New York could have broken the tie in favor of enumeration. Delaware's Gunning Bedford, an ardent nationalist now that his state had achieved great representation in the Senate, moved to insert an even broader and wider grant of national powers, to legislate in all cases for the general interests of the Union. Even Randolph warned that the general government wouldn't then violate laws and aggrandize power, but the convention approved the clause by 6 to 4. Next came the clause empowering Congress to veto all state laws it believed were unconstitutional or in violation of national treaties. The struggle over this clause was basically minor, however, For while the fanatical James Madison, as usual, considered the veto power essential, Roger Sherman, Gouverneur Morris, and even Luther Martin preferred accepting national supremacy in the more softer guise of national judicial supremacy. Thus Sherman thought it unnecessary, as the courts of the states would not consider as valid any law contravening the authority of the Union. And Morris pointed out that a law that ought to be negatived will be set aside in the Judiciary Department, and if that security should fail, may be repealed by a national law. The congressional veto power was removed by a vote of 7-3, only Massachusetts, Virginia, and North Carolina insisting on it. And Martin then moved, and the convention accepted a clause that all constitutional congressional acts and treaties would have to be treated as the supreme law by the states and state courts. Turning to the executive, the Nationalists drove to strengthen still further the independent and dominant executive power. A limitation to a single term was replaced by allowing 2 terms. Next, Dr. James McClurg of Virginia moved to replace 7 years by a life term during good behavior. Gouverneur Morris was undoubtedly overjoyed at this proposal, and Madison, favoring above all the idea of an independently powerful executive, countered George Mason's perceptive and cogent fears of a national monarchy with a clever but empty paradox. A weak executive would lead to revolution and hence to monarchy. The proposal for a lifetime executive was defeated by the close vote of 4-6. Voting for was Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware, and Virginia. The Nationalists next turned to take the power to appoint the Supreme Court from the Senate, as it was represented from the Committee of the Whole, and force it into the executive. James Wilson and Gouverneur Morris urged this change, but it was opposed by Luther Martin. The motion lost by 2-6, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania voting yes, Georgia being absent. The Nationalists were successful, however, in retaining the power of Congress to appoint inferior federal courts, despite the articulated attacks of Luther Martin and Pierce Butler. Randolph and George Mason led the defense. One clause of the committee report provided for a national guarantee to a Republican Constitution and its existing laws to each state. James Wilson explained that the cause was simply designed for the federal government's suppressing of insurrections and rebellions within the states, a clause backed by Randolph and Mason, and changed by Wilson to guarantee a Republican form of government, and to protect each state from foreign and domestic violence. Luther Martin vainly upheld the liberal view. He was for leaving the states to suppress rebellions themselves. The convention was not finished with the executive, and through the remainder of July, the ultra-nationalists, led by Madison, Wilson, and Gouverneur Morris, tried desperately to amend the Virginia Plan report by freeing the executive power from subordination to Congress and allowing it to become an independent and separate power. Again, the Nationalists used democratic demagoguery to advance some form of popular election of the president, independently chosen by special electors, when their real aim was to erect a powerful executive, remote from and uncontrolled by the mass of the people. Thus, the power pyramid of the nation would flow from the top, the president, down to the broad mass of the country. After discussion, the convention finally decided to leave the executive clause as it had been originally reprinted from committee, chosen for 7 years and ineligible for a second term. The Nationalists also tried to change the committee plan by restoring the old idea of a joint executive judicial veto of congressional measures. The idea was to add judicial and executive vetoes on the democratically elected legislatures. The oligarchical judges should not only be able to nullify unconstitutional laws, explained James Wilson and Madison. To his power should be added the right to veto any laws they deemed unwise. Madison professed no worry about excessive power in the executive or judiciary. Only the legislature is to be feared. Thus, the elected legislature was the real source of danger to the American constitutions. Nathaniel Gorham, Luther Martin, and Elbridge Gerry seriously objected that the judge's rule would then confuse the authority and constitutionality of the legislature and judiciary, and give the latter redoubled power. Madison, with his love of paradox, straightforwardly assured that a blending of executive and judiciary was necessary to really keep them separate. And he held up the ultras' favorite model of Great Britain as the example to follow. The nationalist attempt, however, to give the judiciary a vote in the veto power was turned down by 3 to 4 to 2. Yes, Connecticut, Maryland, Virginia. No, Massachusetts, Delaware, North Carolina, South Carolina. Divided, Pennsylvania, Georgia. There was one more crucially important point to settle in this phase of the convention's work: the procedure for ratification of the Constitution then in progress. The moderates and anti-nationalists made a desperate attempt to return to legality and submit the new Constitution to the state legislatures. Ellsworth, Gary, and William Patterson led the fight for this motion. In his reply, Gouverneur Morris made clear that the main reason for referring the Constitution to popular state conventions rather than the legislatures was to evade the unanimity requirement of the Articles. By transcending the Articles together, Morris and the Nationalists were making the revolutionary proposal of launching the Constitution by less than unanimous agreement of the states. The motion for legality failed by 3 to 7, with only Connecticut, Delaware, and Maryland voting aye. The basics of the Virginia Revolution had now been voted upon, and the arch-nationalists had pushed through virtually every element of the reported Virginia plan. Only the small state victory on equal voting in the Senate and the pro-states' rights decisions to have senators chosen by their respective state legislatures marred the record of the large state nationalists' triumph. Their only defeats were on attempts to make their Virginia plan even more centralist and powerful. It is true that the nationalists' cherished veto of state laws had been eliminated, but its substance was retained by enlarging on the rule of federal laws and the federal judiciary. Chapter 18, the Preliminary Draft. The next phase of the convention now began. The basic attributes of the Constitution had been laid down. Now the convention selected a committee of detail, a 5-man committee to actually draft a constitution based on the principles agreed upon during the convention sessions. Of the 5 now uniquely powerful men, only one, Oliver Ellsworth, was somewhat critical of nationalism, while the 4, John Rutledge, Edmund Randolph, Nathaniel Gorham, and James Wilson, were dedicated nationalists. But only James Wilson was a true fanatic. The convention adjourned from July 26 to August 6 to allow the committee to prepare a draft constitution. The draft was prepared by Edmund Randolph, revised by James Wilson, and then submitted to the convention on August 6. The draft committee, however, did not confine itself to the resolutions passed by the convention. Instead, it injected parts of the various plans put before the convention, from the various state constitutions and the Articles of Confederation. In the process, the committee cordially watered down much of the overt nationalism of the convention's resolutions. Particularly important was transforming the general all-inclusive grant of powers to Congress into specifically enumerated powers. Of course, such an enumeration of power, in essence, removed the mantle of ultimate sovereignty from the Congress. Among the powers specifically granted to Congress, to lay and allocate taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the states, to coin money and regulate the value of foreign coins, to establish post offices, to borrow money and emit paper money or bills of credit, to make wars, raise armies and navies, to call up the militia in order to execute the laws of the Union, to enforce treaties, to suppress insurrections and repel invasions, and very faithfully make all laws that shall be necessary and proper for executing the government's power. Another new element in the draft, largely absent from previous debates, was the placing of specific restrictions on the power of Congress. Thus, Congress was prohibited from levying any tax on exports or imposts on importation of slaves, at the behest of the Southern members, or any other direct taxes not proportional to the free population plus 3/5 of slaves. It could also only pass a Navigation Act with consent of 2/3 of each House of Congress, again a Southern demand. Furthermore, the central government was restrained from intervening in a state to protect it against domestic violence, or to subdue rebellion unless requested to do so by the state legislature. The jurisdiction of the Supreme Court was also spelled out and made more specific, thus delineating its power. Instead of the states being subjected to the vague absolute rule of the central government, the draft document imposed specific restrictions on state power. The prohibitions on state actions were designed to assume to the central government a monopoly of certain critical functions: coinage of money, making treaties, emitting paper money, legal tender laws, imposing tariffs, building a standing army and navy in peacetime, and making war. The draft constitution, consisting of a preamble and 23 articles, opened with a clear and straightforward preamble. We, the people of the states of, do ordain, declare, and establish the following constitution for the government of ourselves and our posterity. Apart from the above-mentioned resolutions and changes, there were a few basic alterations. New provisions required the citizens of each state to receive all the privileges and immunities of other states, and each state was to give full faith to the acts and records of the others. New states were to be admitted on the same terms as the original states, but would have to gain the consent of 2/3 of each House of Congress. From August 7 through September 10, the convention debated the draft constitution in detail. The first fight came over the sensible provision that the qualifications in each state for voting for the House of Representatives should be the same as its qualifications for voting for the lower house of the state legislatures. In short, the eligibility of suffrage would be up to each state. Unsurprisingly, Gouverneur Morris was not satisfied, and he moved to restrict the right of suffrage to landowners. In addition to excess democracy, Morris wanted to reduce the state's power over Congress. To this charge of aristocracy, Morris countered with the classic method of the right-wing paradox. The current plan is really aristocratic, because the people in a democratic house would sell their votes to the rich. John Dickinson backed Morris's plan as a necessary defense against the dangerous influence of those multitudes without property and without principle. In his speech, James Madison, of course, cleverly combined both of these arguments. Ellsworth and Mason attacked these points, as did even so rabid a nationalist as Wilson. Ellsworth cogently asked, in effect, why landowners? Ought not every man who pays a tax to vote for the representative who is to levy and dispose of his money? Shall the wealthy merchants and manufacturers, who will bear a full share of the public burdens, be not allowed a voice in the imposition of them? The Morris proposal for restricted suffrage lost by 1 to 7 to 1. Delaware was the only state that approved, while Maryland was divided. The next battle was again a reactionary move on the part of Gouverneur Morris. The draft had requested that a senator be a U.S. citizen for at least 4 years before their election. Morris urged raising the requirement to 14. Madison and Franklin, to their credit, turned liberal on this subject and pleaded eloquently on the importance of foreigners who loved liberty in waging the American Revolution. Randolph was also critical of the proposal, as was Ellsworth. And poor Wilson, a man born in Scotland, was particularly against it. He eloquently denounced the degrading discrimination now proposed. He was strongly backed by the foreign-born Hamilton, who had returned to the convention at just the right time. But rabid reaction on this point held sway. Colonel Mason longed to restrict the Senate to the nation-born, and Pierce Butler and Charles Pinckney of South Carolina hinted of the peculiar danger of foreign attachments. But the most passionate was Gouverneur Morris himself. Calling of all things from reason to moderation, while assuming the darkest prejudices, Morris lashed out bitterly at the rationalist libertarian philosophers, prominent among the intellectuals of the age. As to those philosophical gentlemen, those citizens of the world as they called themselves, he would not trust them. The men who can shake off their attachments to their own country can never love any other. These attachments are the wholesome prejudices which uphold all governments. Gouverneur Morris had indeed touched the chords of bigotry in the members of the convention. The citizen eligibility requirement was raised to 9 years for a senator and from 3 to 7 years for a representative. While the draft constitution had not imposed suffrage requirements on the states, It did authorize Congress to establish property qualifications for its members. While Madison and others wanted the Constitution to fix property qualifications directly, Benjamin Franklin, opportunist, was by far the most liberal, and shrewdly declared that, if honesty was often the companion of wealth, and if poverty was exposed to peculiar temptation, it was not less true that the possession of property increased the desire for more property. Some of the greatest rogues he was ever acquainted with were the richest rogues. From the right, Gouverneur Morris wanted to allow the legislature to set not only property qualifications, but all qualifications for its members. However, on August 10, the entire clause was struck out by a vote of 7-3, with only New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Georgia assenting to the congressional power to set its property qualifications. The lack of suffrage uniformity among the states and strong political opposition were enough to strike out this highly conservative clause of the draft Constitution. Another liberalizing change was to modify the draft requirement of an oath upon all state and national offices to support the Constitution. An affirmation, a clause necessary for such sects as the Quakers, was unanimously approved as a possible alternative to an oath. Charles Pinckney also moved to prohibit all religious tests for any federal office. Again, this important victory for religious freedom was overwhelmingly approved, with only North Carolina against and Maryland divided. On the organization of Congress, the ultra-nationalists tried desperately once more to restore judicial veto power over Congress, led by Madison, and absolute executive veto led by Morris. But after much travail, the two-thirds power to override an executive veto was retained. A long squabble came over the compromise provision, to grant to the House the right to originate money bills not amendable by the upper house. An old Anglo-American tradition to preserve the control of money in the hands of the directly elected representatives of the people. However, the clause was changed to allow the Senate to amend money bills, which effectively evaded the point of the whole provision. The Nationalists went along surprisingly and readily with the shift from an unlimited grant to enumerated grants of power to the central government. Probably the reason for this restrictive anomaly was the broad list of enumerated powers of Congress and the poverty of specific restrictions on that power. Congress would look restricted, when in reality it would have a broad legislative scope over the country. Congress was, first and foremost, granted the power to tax, although direct and poll taxes were required to be proportioned to population, including 3/5 of slaves. There was no opposition to this power, to the commercial power, or to the bulk of the other granted powers. Indeed, the convention added to Congress's power the establishment of post offices, along which it could monopolize the postal service. Congress's proposed broad military powers occasioned much debate. The Nationalists tried to narrow Congress's power to make war into a more concentrated and therefore a more controllable form. Pinckney to the Senate only, Butler to the President himself. While these were defeated, Madison cunningly moved to alter congressional power. Make war became declare war, which left a broad dangerous power for the President, who was grandiosely designated in the draft as the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Army and Navy, and of all the state militias. For now, the President might make war even if only Congress could formally declare it. If Congress had the power to declare war, then it was no more than a lapse to vest the power to make peace in the Congress too. Instead, the draft Constitution placed this power in the oligarchical Senate alone. While Gary and Butler urged the placing in Congress, this attempt was defeated unanimously. The liberals tried valiantly to limit this vast and unlimited scope for national military actions, and Elbridge Gerry and Luther Martin proposed a maximum limit of a few thousand on any national peacetime army. But the proposal was rejected unanimously and scornfully by the convention. However, the power to call up and command the state militias met more heated and sustained opposition. Here rested with the American tradition of anti-militias and of opposition to centralized power. The liberals in that tradition were opposed to any standing army and to any central government control. But the attempt of Ellsworth, Sherman, and Dickinson to restrict central power met sharp defeat. The Nationalists, for their part, tried to bring back the idea of unlimited central government power, to intervene in a state's troubles without request by the state legislature. The Nationalists wanted absolute power to intervene. The Nationalists were repelled, however, by an opposition led by Gary and Luther Martin, and the Subdue Rebellion Clause was eliminated altogether. Not content with the vast enumeration of powers, the Nationalists proposed adding more, and Madison and Pinckney succeeded in inserting grants to Congress that included the power to rule absolutely an enclave of federal government that could be totally apart from the states. They failed to include the power to grant corporate charters or to establish a government university. One successful attempt was made in the convention to remove a grant of congressional power, and the attempt came from none other than the arch-nationalist Gouverneur Morris. Morris's distrust of recent state paper money transcended both his own previous advocacy and his dedication to ultranationalism. Morris wanted to remove the grant of power to Congress to borrow money and to emit paper money. He received support especially from John Langdon of New Hampshire and George Read of Delaware. George Mason and John Francis Mercer of Maryland defended the clause, but the power to emit bills on the credit of the United States, i.e. paper money, was successfully struck from the Constitution, and only Maryland and New Jersey voted against the change. Considering the importance of the public debt question at the end of the war, not much was said about the public debt at the convention. During the 1780s, many states had begun to assume their citizens' share of the national debt, but the result was to aggravate further the problem of the war-born state debts, especially in such high-debt states as Massachusetts. The heavy burden of state debts gave both the state taxpayers and their public creditors an incentive to favor federal assumption, especially of their debts. In this way, the tax burdens could be foisted on the taxpayers of the other more prudent states. South Carolina, another heavily indebted state, led a drive in the convention to impose the national assumption of state debts. Rutledge, Pinckney, and King of Massachusetts managed to refer the whole issue to a Grand Committee. The Grand Committee quickly proposed that Congress be empowered to assume the debts of the old Confederation Congress, as well as the war debts of the U.S. and of the several states. Gary and Gouverneur Morris then insisted that Congress be forced to pay the debts, and the convention agreed. But Mason and Butler raised the issue of why security speculators should benefit from such a generous windfall. Finally, all states except Pennsylvania voted for a Randolph proposal, which conceded the windfall to the speculators and obliged Congress to assume all debts previously assumed by the U.S. Congress. As for the state debts, Hamilton and Madison argued that it would be more expedient and raise less political opposition to postpone decision of this controversial issue and to push the assumption even later as an administrative measure. One crucial indirect consequence of this decision was a proposal by Roger Sherman that the congressional tax power be intimately and expressly connected with paying the national debt. In the final committee appointed at the end of August, this was vaguely adopted by inserting the congressional taxing power to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. In this way, the famous General Welfare Clause slipped through unheralded into the Constitution and was later misdirected and blown up to allow Congress to levy any tax whatsoever as long as it might be used to promote the vague general welfare. While the powers of Congress were enumerated, these grants were added by a vague and important Supremacy Clause. Originally an anti-nationalist clause to replace the congressional veto power over the states, the draft Constitution greatly strengthened the Supremacy Clause by putting acts of Congress and U.S. treaties above state constitutions as well as state laws, and specifically over state as well as federal judges. John Rutledge then was unanimously able to add the U.S. Constitution, as interpreted by inferior or superior courts, a third supreme law over state and state courts. Still not satisfied, Pinckney, Wilson, and Madison tried to insert as well a congressional veto power over all state laws by a 2/3 vote of each house. Opposed were Mason, Rutledge, and Sherman. This proposal lost by the closest vote, 5-6. Yes, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia. No, Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Jersey, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. In contrast to the trampling grants of power, albeit specifically enumerated to Congress, the specific restraints on Congress proposed in the draft were but few. However, this was still a decided improvement over the total power and complete absence of restraint in the Virginia Plan report. Most of these were prohibitions on certain invasions of individual liberty. For example, the crisis of treason, usually loose and totally vague, was restrained in the Constitution. Furthermore, Congress was forbidden to pass bills of attainder or ex post facto laws, and to suspend the right of habeas corpus, although this right was weakened by allowing its suspension, when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. This fateful weakening was put through by Gouverneur Morris. No discriminatory legislation was allowed to benefit one port of a state over another, and ships from one state to another could not be forced to pay duties. The libertarian ex post facto and bills of attainder prohibitions were moved by Elbridge Gerry and James McClurg of Maryland, and there was little disagreement about either. The vote on this prohibition was 7-3-1. Against were Connecticut, New Jersey, Pennsylvania. North Carolina was divided. It is crucial to note that the enthusiasm at the convention for restraints and prohibitions on the states was far more severe than for Congress. This reveals the basic desire to cripple the states and bring them under the aegis of the central government. For example, the states were to be prevented from making treaties without the consent of Congress, from maintaining any peacetime army or navy, making war, granting titles of nobility, as was the central government also prevented from doing so, levying tariffs, emitting paper money, and issuing legal tender laws. States were also prohibited from passing any bills of attainder or ex post facto laws, and in general jury trials were required in criminal cases. The libertarian fervor which prevented invasions of freedom by the states was scarcely matched by any equivalent enthusiasm for limiting the potential actions of the central government. Wilson and Sherman moved to make the prohibitions on state issue of paper money and paper legal tender laws absolute, even with the consent of Congress. Sherman exulted that this was a favorable crisis for crushing paper money, and this prohibition was made absolute by 8-1-1. Only Virginia voted no, and Maryland was divided. The protection of individual contracts from the states was moved by Rufus King and supported by Wilson and Madison. Gouverneur Morris objected in the name of majority rule, and he and Mason thought this was going too far. But the protection finally prevailed. One of the most important debates of the session was waged over the procedure for admitting new states into the Union. The basic provision in the draft Constitution was that new states must be admitted on the same terms with the original states. But this provision scarcely suited the aim of the conservative Easterners to keep perpetual domination over the growing West. Gouverneur Morris, leader of this group, moved quickly to eliminate this requirement for equality of treatment. And despite the opposition of Madison and Mason, Morris's motion was overwhelmingly approved in the seaboard-dominated convention by a vote of 9-2. Only Maryland and Virginia objected to this blatant disregard for Western equality. The next debate was over Morris's proposal to require the consent of any existing state, as well as of Congress, for the admission of any new state out of its present territory. The large states made the general guarantee of their current territory a major sticking point, and threatened to leave the convention if their demands were not met. They were led by Morris and Wilson, with Luther Martin and Daniel Carroll of Maryland leading the opposition. Here again was a recurrence of the old struggle between the large landed and the small landless states, a recurrence prompted by the revolutionary new state movements brewing in the West, as well independent Vermont. Martin, backed by John Dickinson, eloquently urged the uniformity of allowing all the people of the frontier lands, of Western Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, and Maine, which belonged to Massachusetts, to continue without the consent of their state governments. Martin too warned that the small landless states would walk out if they were required to guarantee the Western territories to the large landed states. But only 3 landless and small states, New Jersey, Delaware, and Maryland, took the point of freedom for the Western settler. The Easterners had won the right to consider every new admission on completely arbitrary terms, and to keep the Westerners de novo enthralled if they so desired. There could be no clearer indication that, for the ardent nationalists of Pennsylvania and Virginia, the Declaration of States' Rights applied only to situations where the large states could discriminate. Lest the large landed states be directly threatened, these nationalists revealed quickly enough that their real desire was for power, and not for an abstract ideology of nationalism divorced from a power struggle for land. A slight hitch developed over Vermont, for it was clear that New York would hardly consent to the admission of Vermont, which it claimed for itself, into the United States. This was taken care of in an amendment by Morris himself, which stated that any new state within the jurisdiction, rather than within the limits of an existing state, did not need the consent of that state, and Vermont was evidently not under New York's effective jurisdiction. The draft Constitution had vested a great deal of power in the Senate, especially the power to make treaties, appoint judges and ambassadors, establish courts, and settle disputes between states. The Nationalists, who wished to establish the single executive's power above the power of all other branches or subdivisions of government, chose to transfer all this power to the presidency. Led by Morris, Madison, and Gorham, the convention agreed to at least eliminate the Senate's judiciary functions. The draft Constitution had agreed that the single executive, the president, would be elected for a single term by the Congress. But again, the Nationalists put a desire to overturn the previous convention decision to eliminate this dependency of the president in the representative legislature. The joint problem arose in how the legislature would do the electing. Should the houses of Congress vote separately or jointly? The large state delegates, of course, preferred a joint ballot that would deprive the small states and Senate of much influence in the decision. And this view prevailed by a vote of 7-4. Then the Nationalists worked for a powerful and independent presidency. Their indomitable leader, Gouverneur Morris, urged again a president chosen by a body of popularly elected electors. The Morris motion was first defeated by 6-5, and this important decision was postponed. In theory, an executive is supposed to be a mere enforcer of the laws, in effect an agent of the legislature only. But the Nationalists proceeded to alter this concept and exalt the executive in a highly important textual change. Whenever the draft had stated that the president may recommend measures to the Congress, the convention changed may to shall, which provided a ready conduit to the president for wielding effective lawmaking powers, while the legislature was essentially reduced to a ratification agency of laws proposed by the president. In another fateful change, the president was given the power to create a bureaucracy within the executive by filling all offices not otherwise provided for in the Constitution, in addition to those later created by laws. The convention, led by Gouverneur Morris, also rejected a motion by Dickinson and Randolph to allow Congress to give the states the power to fill some federal offices. Thus, the central government was left in an unchecked domination over federal offices. On the other hand, Roger Sherman was able to win the concession that the president would only be commander-in-chief of the state militias when they were directly in the service of the U.S. government. Chapter 19. The Corrupt Bargain and the Preservation of Slavery. The most important battle of the August days of the Constitutional Convention was waged, as had been the battle over the 3/5 clause between the North and South, and had at its heart the institution of slavery. One of the small number of restrictions on Congress in the draft Constitution was a prohibition on any tax on exports, or of any tax or prohibition on the migration or importation of such persons as the several states shall think proper to admit. In short, there was to be no restriction on the slave trade. Furthermore, no Navigation Act could be passed except by a 2/3 vote in each House of Congress, a hallmark of the Southern distrust of the Northern merchants, one of whose many goals in the drive for a constitution was to privilege themselves through a Navigation Act that would cripple the competition of foreign shippers in the Southern foreign trade. All of these provisions were friendly to the South. 2, the export tax and navigation clauses, were designed to preserve freedom of Southern trade against Northern attempts to seize privileges or revenues from the South. 1, on the importation of slaves, was designed to preserve the traffic in slaves. Already, Gouverneur Morris in early August had made an unsuccessful attempt to rescind the 3/5 clause decided upon in July, and Mason and the South were joined by Massachusetts and Connecticut in opposing the prohibition of exploiting the as existing minority South through export taxation. Then, on August 21, the slavery issue burst forth once more. Luther Martin of Maryland began proceedings by demonstrating that he was interested in individual liberty as well as states' rights. Martin flatly proposed a prohibition or a tax on the importation of any slaves, for the encouragement of slavery embodied in the 3/5 clause was inconsistent with the principles of the Revolution and dishonorable to the American character. John Rutledge replied in an interesting and revealing manner. In defending the slave trade, Rutledge insisted that religion and humanity had nothing to do with this question. Interest alone is the governing principle with nations. In short, moral principle was to be turned over in favor of vested economic interest. Or rather, vested economic interest was to be elevated to the status of moral principle, overriding all other considerations. Charles Pinckney used slightly different tactics and upheld empirical evidence and custom over moral principle. If slavery be wrong, it is justified by the example of all the world. In all ages, 1/2 of mankind has been slaves. Pinckney, of course, was speaking from the vantage point of the slave-owning half rather than the enslaved. His second cousin, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, added flatly that South Carolina and Georgia cannot do without slaves, i.e. the slave owners, not the enslaved inhabitants, of these states could not make do. Pinckney also used a primitive Keynesian multiplier analysis to demonstrate the benefits of slavery and slave importation for the whole country. The more slaves, the more produced to employ the carrying trade, the more consumption also, and the more of this, the more revenue for the common treasury. Both Pinckney, Rutledge, and Abraham Baldwin of Georgia threatened dissolution of the convention if it should intervene in any way with the slave trade. One interesting aspect of the decision was George Mason's eloquent speech denouncing the slave trade and even slavery itself. He insisted that only South Carolina and Georgia still permitted slave imports, and denounced the immorality, tyranny, and sins of slavery. Mason denounced Northern merchants who had engaged in this traffic, and urged that Congress have the power to prevent the slave trade. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney and Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, in reply, staunchly pointed to the reason for Virginia's eloquence in attacking the slave trade. Since the Virginians, despite the eloquence and depth of Mason's attack, were not, after all, proposing to proceed against slavery itself, Ellsworth and Pinckney saw in the Virginian stand the new makings of a vested economic interest of this aim, slave breeding. As Ellsworth trenchantly pointed out, if it, slavery, was to be considered in a moral light, we ought to go farther and free those already in the country, as slaves also multiply so fast in Virginia and Maryland that it is cheaper to raise than import them, whilst in the sickly rice swamps further south foreign supplies are necessary. If we go no farther than is urged, we shall be unjust towards South Carolina and Georgia. Similarly, Pinckney stated, as to Virginia, she will gain by stopping the importations. Her slaves will rise in value, and she has more than she wants. Both Ellsworth and his Connecticut colleague Roger Sherman tried to justify their acceptance of the slave trade by lightly and complacently opining that all the states would eventually abolish slavery themselves by degrees. Sherman expressed his opinion that such an issue should not obstruct the business of forming a new constitution. John Dickinson attacked the slave trade as inadmissible on every principle of honor and safety, and James Wilson wryly observed that if defenders of the right of the slave trade were maintaining that South Carolina and Georgia would probably soon abolish it themselves, then there was no reason for them to stay out of a union that might prohibit that trade. In the midst of this critical rift, however, Gouverneur Morris, who had been one of the loudest talkers against slavery and had deemed it as a nefarious institution and the curse of heaven, now proposed a bargain. The slave trade, export tax, and Navigation Act clauses should all be recommitted to a special committee, and these things may form a bargain. In short, Morris realized that the benefits of special privilege to Northern merchants in a Navigation Act would undoubtedly outweigh in the minds of Northern delegates the attraction of an abstract principle. The export tax and slave trade clauses were then referred to a special committee, one member from each state, by a vote of 7-3. Those who held out against Morris's corrupt bargain were New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Massachusetts was absent. On committal of the restrictive clauses in the Navigation Act, only Connecticut and New Jersey voted nay. In the course of the debate on this committal, Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts said very revealingly, he desired it to be remembered that the Eastern states had no motive to union but a commercial one. 2 days later, on August 24th, the Grand Committee returned with its dearly agreed-upon bargain. Number 1. The importation of slaves could not be prohibited until 1800, but Congress could tax such imports at a rate no higher than the average duty on imported goods. The latter concern had already been hinted at by Rutledge and Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Number 2. The two-thirds requirement on navigation acts was dropped. The Northern, especially New England merchants, had the power to impose navigation acts, and the slave trade was to be tightly insulated for over a decade. The first move on the committee report was Charles Cotesworth Pinckney's amendment, which proposed to extend the term of an inviolate slave trade from 1800 to 1808, thus providing the slavers a 20-year grace. Most significantly, Gorham of Massachusetts, who was the delegate most anxious to impose a navigation law, seconded Pinckney's motion. Over the strenuous objections of James Madison, the 20-year term was approved by 7-4. Only New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Virginia voted no. Not only Maryland, but all of shipping-oriented New England voted cozily with the hardened slave states of the Deep South. After the maximum duty on imported slaves was changed to $10 per person, the slave trade clause of the bargain was passed by the identical 7-4 vote. At this point on August 29, Charles Pinckney dramatically moved to scuttle the bargain with the North by proposing to restore the two-thirds requirement, not only for navigation acts, but for any law for the purpose of regulating the commerce of the U.S. with foreign powers. Pinckney eloquently denounced oppressive regulations that would be imposed by a tyranny of a majority of the North's commercial interests. The liberal Luther Martin eagerly seconded the motion, and George Mason backed the proposal as protecting the rights of the Southern minority. The North, of course, opposed Pinckney's proposal on behalf of freedom of trade. The shocked George Clymer of Pennsylvania protested that the Northern and Middle states will be ruined, if not enabled to defend themselves against foreign regulations. Gouverneur Morris indignantly protested in the usual argument from Paradox of the Ultras that navigation acts would really benefit the South. First, subsidies to American ships will multiply them and eventually make the shipping trade cheaper than at present, i.e., the Southerners should sacrifice the current and foreseeable economy for a purportedly improved one in some distant and indefinite future. Second, only a navigation act subsidizing American shippers and seamen could build an American Navy essential to security, particularly of the Southern states, from some unspecified menace. The fact that the liberal opposition remained unconvinced by these specious arguments did not, of course, allay the enthusiasm of Morris and the other nationalists for the navigation acts. The other ultranationalists, of course, objected to any such restriction in national power. James Wilson fumed at the problems of the minority and called for unchecked majority rule. Madison, picking up the sophistry of the proto-Keynesian multiplier from Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, maintained the Nationalist Paradox. The navigation subsidies would really benefit the South by increasing the wealth of the East, and hence the consumption of Southern products. And therefore, all this would be a national benefit. As in all such multiplier paradoxes, the contra-multiplier effect of not spending the money seized to pay the subsidy, or the effect of coercively diverting trade from its most efficient and profitable channels, was conveniently overlooked. For his part, the blunt Nathaniel Gorham of Massachusetts was far more candid. To Gorham, the substance was simple and the threat explicit. If the government is to be so fettered as to be unable to relieve the eastern states, what motive can they have to join in it? Most illuminating were the statements of those Southerners who were willing to betray the interests of the traders and the consensus of their sector, and indeed of the consensus of the country, for the sake of the corrupt bargain to save the slave trade. Pierce Butler announced his distaste of navigation acts, but he frankly opposed the motion of his South Carolina colleague in order to conciliate the affections of the eastern states. And John Rutledge warned that a navigation act was necessary for New England's desire to secure the West Indies trade. After all, declared Rutledge, taking the grand view, we are laying the foundation for a great empire. But it was Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, one of the architects of the bargain, who delivered the fullest rebuttal to his cousin's motion against navigation acts. He admitted that it was the truest interest of the Southern states to have no regulation of commerce. But the Eastern states, New England, had lost much commerce since the Revolution, and considering their liberal conduct towards the views of South Carolina on importing slaves, he thought it proper that no fetters should be imposed in the power of making commercial regulations. Charles Cotesworth Pinckney ended in a remarkably oleaginous note. Prejudiced against the New Englanders before the convention, he now found them good fellows indeed, as liberal and candid as any men whatever. With this arrival of the compact by the leadership of the Deep South, the entire bargain was truly sealed. The bargain essentially benefited New England ship owners and the Southern slave owners at the expense of consumers and other beneficiaries of the freedom of trade. Charles Pinckney's motion was then voted out of order by a vote of 7-4. And the scuttling of the Navigation Act clause was then approved unanimously. This scuttling was later reaffirmed again in a desperate attempt to restore the clause by George Mason. It was not apparently enough for the Northerners to sell their anti-slave principles for the sake of a strong national government and navigation subsidy to Eastern ship owners. In the spirit of happy harmony and good fellowship now permeating the convention, the assembled notables helped fasten far more securely the chains of black slaves in America. The draft Constitution had simply provided that any slave escaping to another state should be extradited to the original state. Pierce Butler of South Carolina moved to add to this clause a fugitive slave and servant law, a motion that passed the convention not only unanimously, but without one iota of debate. This infamous clause expressly provided that even if slavery had been abolished in the state to which the slave may flee, it must deliver up the slave on demand of his master. Slavery was now driven into the heart of the Constitution, in the 3/5 clause, in the protection of slave importation for 20 years, in the fugitive slave clause, and even in the congressional power to suppress insurrections within the state. The fact that the words slave and slavery do not appear explicitly in the Constitution does not change unduly this judgment. Indeed, the habitual use of such terms as other persons, such person, or person held to labor instead of slave were simply shamefaced evasions by men who knew that they were betraying anti-slave principles dominant in their constituencies. To Luther Martin, therefore, the American Constitution was a grave betrayal of the idea of equal rights set forth in the Declaration of Independence. The Revolution, Martin strikingly declared, was grounded in defense of the natural God-given rights possessed by all mankind. But the Constitution was an insult to that God, who views with equal eye the poor African slave and his American master. Another deep failing of the Constitution from the standpoint of liberty was the failure to include a Bill of Rights, a prohibition against governmental interference with individual rights. All of the revolutionary state constitutions had included these cherished provisions, and on August 20, Charles Pinckney proposed clauses that amounted to a Bill of Rights, to a list of prohibitions on national government interference with individual freedom. Pinckney urged that the freedom of the press be inviolably preserved, and that soldiers may not be quartered in homes in peacetime without the owner's consent. During the final act of the convention in mid-September, Elbridge Gerry and Hugh Williamson of North Carolina urged the requirement of jury trials in civil cases as well as criminal, Gerry wanting of the necessity of juries to guard against corrupt judges. This prompted George Mason, the author of the Great Virginia Bill of Rights, backed by Gerry, to move for a committee to propose a Bill of Rights for the Constitution. But Gorham and Sherman protested that Congress may be safely trusted, and the convention, so feeble was its devotion to liberty, voted unanimously against any Bill of Rights. Pinckney and Gerry soon returned to the attack, moving to insert a clause that the liberty of the press should be inviolably observed. Sherman scornfully asserted that the power was unnecessary, since Congress had no power over the press, and the convention then voted the freedom of the press clause down by a vote of 4-7. It was backed by Massachusetts, Maryland, Virginia, and South Carolina. Chapter 20. The Ratification and Amendment Process. A particularly vital aspect of the Constitution was the procedure to be set up for its ratification. The draft proposed that the Constitution be submitted to Congress and then to special conventions so that state legislatures could be circumvented. More importantly, it imposed a revolution in the country's polity because it proposed that only a certain number of states would need to ratify to put the Constitution into effect, a strong violation of the Confederation's unanimity principle. The draft left blank the number of states needed to ratify the Constitution, and James Wilson began discussion of ratification by proposing that only 7 state conventions had to ratify. Wilson brusquely dismissed existing law or rights and employed an irrelevant metaphor. The house on fire must be extinguished, without a scrupulous regard to ordinary rights. Madison supported this view, though he suggested that the number might be raised to 8 or 9 states. Daniel Carroll of Maryland demanded unanimity being necessary to dissolve the existing Confederacy, which had been unanimously established. Finally, Randolph's proposal of 9 was adopted by a vote of 8-3, the 3 holdouts being Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina. Rufus King also moved to clarify that the Constitution would only apply to the states ratifying it. Obviously, it could not be imposed on the other states short of open war. What of the state conventions? Even Gouverneur Morris relented from the ultra-nationalistic program and moved to allow every state to ratify whichever way it wished. Madison insisted that the special convention would be the most likely to ratify, and King became yet another delegate to hint of dissolution if the draft was changed. For his part, Luther Martin led the pro-state legislature opposition. But state conventions were retained, and the 9-state convention clause of the Constitution was voted by all states except Maryland, whose nay vote was led by Martin and Carroll. Finally, there was the question of submitting the Constitution to Congress for approval. Charles Pinckney and Gouverneur Morris now brusquely moved to end the need for congressional approval. Instead, the Constitution would be submitted to state conventions regardless, the idea being to ram the Constitution through the conventions before the people could have second thoughts. Or as Morris put it, any delay would allow the state government leaders to intrigue and turn the popular current against it. In other words, deliberation and modification were not needed anymore, as all of the important discussion had occurred by the wise men at the convention. Luther Martin, staunchly opposed to this critical nationalist scheme, was certainly more accurate. It is true, he maintained, that after a while the people would be against it, the Constitution, but for a different reason. He believed they would not ratify it unless hurried into it by surprise. Elbridge Gerry backed Martin in opposition. This particular proposal was defeated, but the essence of the plan was approved, and the approval of Congress was no longer required in the Ratification Clause. Gerry and Mason moved to postpone the whole clause, and Mason bitterly denounced the Constitution, declaring that he would sooner chop off his right hand than put it to the Constitution as it now stands, and hinted at a later constitutional convention to redo many defeated parts. Randolph concurred and suggested that state conventions be free to propose amendments to be submitted to another convention. Without this, the people would only have a chance to ratify or reject a document handed to them as a whole fait accompli. On the other hand, the Randolph proposal would actually allow the people to participate in the constitution-making process. Morris agreed and sarcastically argued that he looked forward to another convention, but one that would erect a much tighter central government, a convention that will have the firmness to provide a vigorous government, which we are afraid to do. However, postponement was defeated by 3-8. In favor, New Jersey, Maryland, North Carolina. And the new ratification clause was approved by 10-1, only Maryland opposing. In mid-September, Elbridge Gerry renewed the attack. He picked up a most unexpected ally in Alexander Hamilton, who had returned to the convention in Philadelphia to take part in the final debates. Hamilton argued that not only should Congress have the power to approve the Constitution, but that the state legislatures should also turn the Constitution over to their respective conventions. Randolph, one of the main framers of the Constitution, insisted that he could not agree to it if the ratification clause were not changed, specifically for his plan of a second convention after the state decisions were recorded. The Hamilton plan, supported by Gerry, was bitterly attacked by his old fellow ultranationalist James Wilson. Wilson declared that it would be unsafe to give the Constitution to Congress, because with New York, Rhode Island, and Maryland reflecting strong disapproval of the proposed Constitution, a 9-state requirement would barely succeed. King, Rutledge, and George Clymer of Pennsylvania backed Wilson, and the Hamilton-Gerry attempt lost on several votes, the last one being unanimous. Congressional approval was eliminated from the ratification of the Constitution. In mid-September, Virginia Governor Edmund Randolph, who was at this time now a moderate, made a desperate attempt to revive his cogent plan for a second convention that would consider state convention amendments to the Constitution. It was a poignant moment, as this marked the beginning of the end of the convention. Randolph warned that he could not sign the Constitution unless his proposal was adopted. Earlier, Randolph had spelled out his objections to the developing Constitution and believed that the government would end in tyranny. Randolph particularly objected to the unlimited power for a standing army, the broad necessary and proper clause, the lack of restraint on power to pass navigation acts, and generally an excessive power in the federal government. George Mason seconded the motion, heavily noting that the dangerous power of the central government would end in tyranny. Warning, too, that he could not sign the Constitution without this amendment, Mason cogently declared, "This Constitution had been formed without the knowledge or idea of the people." A second convention will know more of the sense of the people, and be able to provide a system more consonant to it. It was improper to say to the people, "Take this or nothing." Elbridge Gerry, a highly prominent delegate involved in the hammering out of the Constitution, backed up Randolph and Mason. He too could not sign unless a second constitutional convention was held. Gerry particularly objected to the vague and broad power of Congress in the necessary and proper clause, to its unlimited power to raise navies and armies, and to no requirement for trial by jury in civil cases. Charles Pinckney, however, replied that the Constitution would then not be agreed upon. Conventions, he rather absurdly declared, are serious things and ought not to be repeated. And despite the poignant warnings of such moderates and luminaries of the convention as Randolph, Mason, and Gerry, The convention, in its penultimate act, rejected Randolph's motion unanimously. A final question was the provision for future amendments to the Constitution. The draft provided for amendments to be proposed by 2/3 of the states, which would compel Congress to call a convention to consider them. This initiative in the states and in a special convention pleased the liberals and moderates, but did not satisfy the Nationalists, who wanted all the power in the central government. Fearful of any amending power in the states, Madison and Hamilton, now back on the ultra-nationalist track, moved to make amending the Constitution far more difficult by placing the imprimatur under the aegis of Congress. Congress could propose amendments by a 2/3 vote of each house, or upon application of 2/3 of the states, and they would then be ratified by 3/4 of state legislatures or state conventions. Crucially, Congress had full authority to either propose amendments or call for state conventions. The convention agreed to this proposal by a vote of 9-1. In mid-September now, however, the unmoved moderates tried again. Roger Sherman declared his warning that amendments might literally destroy a minority of states. And George Mason warned that the congressional control of amendments would deprive the people of liberating amendments, if the government should become oppressive, as he verily believed would be the case. Gouverneur Morris moved to mollify the moderates. He and Gary proposed to compel Congress to require a new convention upon application by 2/3 of the states. The proposal passed unanimously, but the ultimate power remained with Congress. For, although the Nationalists were forced to make concessions, they had achieved their aim of transferring control of the amending process from the states to Congress. The states were left with a passive role. They must await the submission of amendments to them. They had lost their power to propose amendments, and they have never used their right to request a constitutional convention. As early as the August decision, the convention had made a special and rare resolution upon any future amendment process. At the behest of John Rutledge, to the Madison-Hamilton resolution was added a provision that no amendments before 1808 could be made that would affect the slave importation clause. Here was yet another strengthening of slavery in the American Constitution, a clause cheerfully agreed to almost unanimously at the convention. Now, in the September session, the moderates and states' writers tried to add further clauses to the Constitution that would be beyond amendment, i.e., never changeable by the people of future generations. Sherman moved that no state without its consent might ever be disturbed in the absolute use of its internal police power, or be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. The motion was defeated by 3-8, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Delaware approving. But Morris, in seeing the restlessness of the small states, proposed the equality of states in the Senate clause, and passed it unanimously without debate. In this offhand way, the framers of 1787 laid their dead hand upon all future generations of Americans, arrogantly dictating to them that they could virtually never choose to change the structure of voting in the Senate without the consent of every state. Chapter 21. The Election of the President. All the articles of the draft plan having been considered by the convention, the amended draft was referred on August 31 to a grand committee of unfinished parts. In the committee, the Nationalists, not content with their plethora of victories, launched several important offensive strikes and secured crucial victories. It was confirmed that the Senate was allowed to amend money bills originating in the House, and the vital treaty-making and appropriations powers were transferred from the Senate to the President, although the sop was there to the small states that the Senate must approve all appointments, and 2/3 must ratify treaties. The General Welfare Clause was added to the power to tax, a clause of ambiguous meaning at the time, which much later became a vehicle for unchecked expansion of the federal government's powers. Most significantly, Madison and Morris were able to alter the convention's decision for Congress to choose the president and provide for an independent executive chosen by electors, who in turn were chosen directly by the legislatures of the various states. It was assumed, however, that the Senate, by having the ultimate power to choose among the candidates if none received an electoral majority, would really be exercising the decisive electing power. For it was believed that many candidates would be voted for by the electors. Furthermore, the president's term was reduced from 7 to 4 years. He was made eligible for indefinite re-election, and he was required to have been an American citizen for 14 years before becoming president. A major advocate of the new plan was Morris, who emphasized the indispensable necessity of an independent and powerful executive. Randolph and Rutledge inserted that Congress should elect, and Mason, Wilson, and Dixon wanted the more popular House rather than the more oligarchical Senate to have the ultimate decision to choose the president. From the right, Madison tried to bypass Congress almost completely by allowing any candidate with 1/3 of the electoral vote to become president. But this suggestion was overwhelmingly defeated. The committee report was presented back to the convention on September 4 and the day following. The major struggle was waged over the suddenly new model of selecting the president. Rutledge attacked the president's re-eligibility and denounced the Senate's new ultimate decision-making role as creating a real and dangerous aristocracy to go alongside the quasi-monarchic development of the executive office. Wilson and Randolph, however, led the attempt to give the entire Congress, rather than the Senate, the ultimate power of choice by a vote of 3 to 7 to 1. Pennsylvania, Virginia, South Carolina 4, and New Hampshire divided. While Wilson, Mason, and others continued to attack the dangerous and inadmissible aristocracy, this placed in the Senate, Hamilton predictably urged the ultra-nationalist Madison idea of bypassing Congress by electing the man with the highest number of electoral votes. Finally, the question was resolved by Roger Sherman, who suggested that the House hold the ultimate power of choice, but 1 vote per state rather than per congressman. This obviously sensible compromise, taking the power out of the oligarchical Senate, but giving the small states equal voting in the House for their particular vote, was voted for overwhelmingly, with only Delaware in opposition. The clause was also clarified to provide that a majority of states in the House be required to elect a president. One concession that the committee had made to the anti-nationalists was to transfer the power to impeach the president and other appointed officers from the House and the Supreme Court, appointed by the president, to the independent Senate. The committee had very narrowly limited the grounds for impeachment, treason, and bribery. George Mason made a critical point in checking the executive power, that maladministration be added to the grounds for impeachment. Such a clause could have made the president and the rest of the executive truly dependent on the representative body, the Congress. But Madison persuaded Mason and the convention to substitute the still formidably narrow other high crimes and misdemeanors against the state. From the other side, Madison and Pinckney tried to free the executive from the Congress altogether by putting the impeachment power back in the Supreme Court. But even Gouverneur Morris objected to a small corruptible Supreme Court having such power, and this proposal was defeated. The committee's transfer of the critical appointment power from the Senate to the president produced opposition by the moderates. Mason expressly urged that appointments were too dangerous a power to treat to a president, and that it instead should be given to an executive council. On the ultra-right, Wilson proposed that the Senate be stripped even of its power to ratify presidential appointments. The Constitution indeed had further strengthened the presidential appointment power, allowing him the sole right to make lengthy appointments during the recesses of the Senate. The convention, at Nationalist behest, had earlier changed the power to override the presidential veto to 3/4 of each house. But now, over bitter objections, the convention narrowly returned to the 2/3 clause. As to the treaty-making power which the committee had given to the president, while leaving the ratification power to 2/3 of the Senate, the debate in the convention was brief but illuminating. The Nationalists, who wanted to strip Congress of as much treaty power as possible, were here split on north-south lines. The South bitterly remembered the Jay-Gardoqui Treaty, and any further treaties might also be expected to benefit northern merchants and shippers, perhaps at the expense of Southern planters or Western settlers. The two-thirds clause was then a concession to Southern interests. Thus, Wilson argued for a simple majority of both houses in order to ratify, while even Madison, on the other hand, proposed that two-thirds of the Senate be empowered to make treaties on its own, without consent of the president. For he argued cogently that a wartime president would have so much power that he might well balk at making peace. He was seconded by Pierce Butler of South Carolina, who defended the proposal as a necessary security against ambitious and corrupt presidents. For the ultra-nationalists, Gouverneur Morris spelled it out. A simple majority is necessary for peace treaties. Otherwise, Congress would not be willing to make war to gain the fisheries and the Mississippi River, two great objects of the Union. Here was a clear-cut indication of the neglected role that the power for aggressive war and any adventurous foreign policy played in the drive for the new Constitution. Thus, as in the struggle over the Navigation Acts, export taxes, the power to admit new states, and the protection of the slave trade, Northern nationalists showed themselves to be a bit more motivated for absolute central power than were the Southerners, who were continually checked by their economic interests. For their part, Gary and Sherman predictably urged an even greater majority than two-thirds as needed for the treaty power. The convention quickly concluded the issue by retaining the committee provisions. On September 8, the convention chose a committee of style to draw up the final draft of the Constitution. Of the 5 members in the committee, 4, Hamilton, Madison, Gouverneur Morris, and King, were ultra-nationalist, and only 1, William Samuel Johnson of Connecticut, was a moderate. The committee's stylistic revision, submitted to the convention, was ultimately the sole work of Morris, who, by slyly substituting a semicolon for a comma, tried to erect an unambiguously independent and therefore very broad general welfare clause. The convention, however, returned the vital comma. Morris also added a grandiose preamble, which, however, was partially based on the preamble clause of the Articles of Confederation, and in any case conferred no substantive powers whatever. On September 15, the final revised draft of the Constitution was submitted to the convention and passed unanimously in essentially the same form. A last-minute unanimously approved change on the 17th revised the number of representatives to 1 for every 30,000 instead of every 40,000 people. This made the House a bit more democratic and closer to the people. Then, after some quibbling about the form of signatures of the Constitution and the entrusting of the secret records of the Constitution to George Washington, the Constitutional Convention ended on September 17. The Nationalists had succeeded, and the new Constitution was ready to be sprung upon an unsuspecting country.